Hi Ron, it's Kristen here. Sorry, this is one of those times where the recording of the live session failed to come out, so I'm having to redo it. Probably won't be as long and perhaps as involved, but at least cover the slide. So if you want to kind of get the whole mix, you've got this there to look at. So we're looking at we just left. In my mind, it's a couple of weeks ago now. We had just left the children of Israel as they were leaving Egypt. And so we're going to look at the beginning of their journey and the crossing of the sea, so Sukkoth to the Red Sea. So let's kind of carry through the slides. So it happened that when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God didn't lead them by the way of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and they return to Egypt. And there's a kind of an interesting little dynamic, because God kind of leads them, but actually then he turns them around and takes them back. But to start with, the children of Israel, they avoid, and I've kind of marked it in red, you can see it on the map. The way of the land of the Philistines is that there's actually, the top of Egypt where the Israelites have been in the Nile Delta, and the land of the Philistines, which is eventually going to become the land of Canaan. It's going to be where the Israelites come in. But actually, it is a kind of a route that runs along the Mediterranean coast. So I should say it simply as that. So the children of Israel are led away from that, and the initial thing is they're probably still quite nervous. They're still at the beginning of this journey, and it may simply be this is a very well fortified route. Archaeologically, we know that there's a whole series of forts along here. We're going to think in a minute as well how the waterways are used to force kind of people coming into Egypt and out of Egypt through quite a narrow neck, which gave Egypt a kind of very strong defensive position against those that were coming in, and in this case, in trying to leave, they would have to go through this kind of fortified series of, well, a series of forts as they're leaving. And so initially, God leads them out of the land of Goshen, out of the Nile Delta, and takes them to a place called Sukkoth. It says, lest that my people change their mind. So maybe a Mediterranean Sea route is not such a good option. So God led them away by the way of the wilderness, by the Red or the Reed Sea, and the children of Israel went up in fives out of the land of Egypt. That's the way that actually the Hebrew reads. I put it in question mark, because you probably won't see that in most of your translations. It will say things like they went up armed or in array. But the actual Hebrew is they went up in fives. Exactly what it means is not clear, but it seems to indicate some kind of level of the sense of magnitude and order. And they gather in Sukkoth, which is as a place name allows us to kind of identify, it's very close to the Hebrew context of Sukkot, I think it is, isn't it? Which is a tabernacle, or it's a booth, it's a tent that you live in. It's kind of interesting how this little etymological thing that they start their journey in a place that sounds to their ears like it's a tent. It's a temporary place, but it kind of seems that Sukkoth becomes a sort of gathering point. And remember, they've initially, when Pharaoh has been talked to, the issue has been, we're going to just go out into the wilderness and sacrifice. As time has gone on and the plagues have got worse and worse and worse, there's a kind of an assumption that they're going to leave for good, but it's never been explicitly stated and kind of given to them as permission. So they're in a slightly ambiguous state. But they've kind of come to the edge of the wilderness here at Sukkoth. And this is kind of an interesting, it's possibly a kind of a gathering point. We know that there are Israelites that have run all the way down the Nile. We found inscriptions right the way down in Thebes and so on. And very interestingly, at the end of the 13th dynasty, so the period we're looking at as for the Exodus, and what we do know is that there was a workers' kind of village, the age of Kahun, and it was suddenly abandoned. People just suddenly left it. Traditionally, it's been seen as too early for the Exodus, but by moving the Exodus forwards, dragging Egyptian history up a little bit, the two actually kind of can potentially coincide. So it's kind of interesting just to speculate that Sukkoth becomes a gathering point. The majority of the children of Israel come out from the Nile Delta, but actually word has gone down to Kahun, and perhaps they're waiting there. And en masse they down tools and leave, and we actually have the archaeological evidence for that. So they once they've gathered there for a few days, we then read. So they set out from Sukkoth and they camped at Etham. And Etham there's been various speculations. It may come from the Egyptian word Chetem, which is a border fortress, which makes a lot of sense to me. Because actually they are still technically within the land of Egypt. They've not left the land of Egypt at this point. And there's a kind of an interesting sort of problem which is often ignored when we do our routes and so on for the Exodus, which every theory, doesn't really matter what period you want to put it into, is going to have to address at some level. And that problem is the problem of what I've called there the walls of the ruler. It's something we find in texts of Egypt for going back long period of time. The walls of the ruler seems to be a fortification system, and as we're going to see, and what I've highlighted on the map here is by the time we do get to Ramesses, we actually see the walls of the ruler being identified with a canal. And it shows him kind of coming back and crossing a canal which is full of crocodiles and so on. Some parts of that canal have been kind of evident for quite a few years, but in actual fact we now understand that this canal system, way before Suez, actually connects a number of large water bodies that kind of run from the Mediterranean down to the Gulf of Suez, and they're all kind of joined together, and a large canal had been dug out. So way back from in Egypt's history this has been established. And of course it gives a very simple way of kind of controlling the ins and outs and so on of people coming into your nation. So the only time really Egypt had been invaded until the more modern ancient history period, the Romans and the Greeks and so on, was from the south by the Ethiopians. But it's much harder because they've got this kind of big water wall that runs down, and so it doesn't matter what kind of theories you have as to where the Red Sea crossing happens. Is it the Gulf of Suez? Is it the Gulf of Aqaba? Or is it in the seas of reeds that run down this kind of period, down this kind of passage? You have to address the issue of how do they get across the wall. If getting across the wall is not actually part of the crossing of the sea that they do, they have to cross it. Perhaps the best way of thinking of it like that. So, yes, okay, here you go, a little bit about the walls of the ruler. We've known from inscriptions for a long time that we found the remnants of defensive canal that runs the entire length from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And they've actually, as time has gone on, they were identified by the Geological Survey of Israel. A couple of guys, Amichai Snee and Tuvia Weisbrod, I guess that's how you say it. That's one of them. I can't remember which one it is now. And it's that dotted blue line. I think on the previous one, actually, I've got... if I go back to the previous slide, I've got a little bit showing you the top end as well. Sorry, I'm pointing at my screen, you can't see that, but you notice at the top I've kind of extended that little bit of canal that comes out of the body of water, which is the Yam Suf, or the Sea of Reeds, or or Partufti, as the Egyptians call it, which is just the reeds, which are these inland waterways that were full of reeds. And so when we read that phrase, that they're going to cross the Red Sea, and the Hebrew actually reads the Sea of Reeds, and so we have to work out, is it the Red Sea or is it the Sea of Reeds, or are they the same thing? We'll think about that in a second, but just to kind of finish this slide, you'll notice that it's possibly 70 meters wide. Well, not possibly, the excavation actually shows that this canal kind of runs all the way up, joining these bodies of water. So where there's not a body of water, it joins one to another, and up to 70 meters wide, which is 3 tennis courts across. So it's quite a large and formidable thing to get across. And the children of Israel have come out to Sukkoth. They've encamped there. They head towards Etam, which is probably related to the word for the border fortress, which means it's probably somewhere on that wall of the ruler, that large canal system. And they've got to work out what they need to do. So they set out from Sukkoth and they encamped at Etam. And Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they may go ahead by day or by night. Now, just as an interesting kind of little throw up, I don't want to make too big a thing of it, because there are clearly supernatural elements here in the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. But certainly if Mount Sinai is a bit of an active volcano, if it does explode, then actually it would create a visible pillar of smoke during the day, and at night when you can't see the smoke but you can see the flashes of lightning that go up and down in that pillar of smoke. I think I've got a quote on the next slide actually on that. Yeah, there we go. This is from the 1980s St Helens eruption. Notice that there's lightning bolts that run tens of thousands of feet high, so they're not small trivial little lightning bolts that run up the channel of smoke. So you could imagine if there was that eruption at some level, particularly as they approach it, you can see the pillar of cloud ahead of you. So even if that is happening down there in Arabia, there seems to be something else going on kind of locally for the local children of Israel, but God is now kind of leading them out of, and he is becoming proactive, which would give them much more confidence and great courage as they start off. And at that point, we suddenly discover, so it doesn't explain everything about the cloud of fire, but it's this kind of combination of supernatural and natural that God often uses. But in the okay, I'm totally forgetting where this is, what slides come next in the way things go forwards. But so I'll stick with the slides. Yeah. So where is it that this pillar is going to lead them? It says it leads them to the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea. Red Sea comes from the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, but the Hebrew version refers to the Sea of Reeds. But as I said, there are waterways that run right the way from the Mediterranean right the way down to the Gulf of Suez, and they are full of reeds, and the Egyptians even referred to them as the reeds. And so the Sea of Reeds is often said, well, it's those inland waterways. And then others have said, well, actually, but part of the mix is these extensive freshwater waterways run down to the Gulfs of Suez and Aqaba. Actually, in both of those locations, you have reeds that run right up to the sea, which is actually an unusual phenomenon because reeds don't thrive well in salt water. But actually, where there's a large body of fresh water running into the sea, you can get a situation where reeds run right up to it. And certainly when you get into the Book of Kings, I think it is, the sea, the phrase the Reed Sea, the Yam Suf, which is the Hebrew, is used very clearly for the Gulf of Aqaba, and it's described very specifically. So it's been suggested various things, that actually the Sea of Reeds and Red Sea probably are used interchangeably for the whole kind of triangle of the two gulfs. And the waterways that kind of run right the way out of those, kind of up through the geography, running up towards the Mediterranean, of the fresher water lakes, which therefore can sustain reeds. But in the context of thinking about the Exodus, it makes sense to see them as part of this barrier wall as the children of Israel are leaving Goshen and they're heading towards the wilderness of Sinai. They've got to get across this combination of lakes and canals, which creates the defensive border for the Egyptians. So Yahweh spoke to Moses and said, speak to the children of Israel that they turn back. So they've come in a route that's avoided them going up to the Mediterranean route and the run towards the land of the Philistines, and they've gathered themselves together at Sukkoth, and numbers have probably gathered there, and then suddenly the cloud has appeared and the fire, which gives them a lot more confidence. And as the Lord leads them, he actually turns them back. So it's kind of implying that they're going now back towards the lands of the Philistines. And that we read there, Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they become entangled in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. There's this kind of wall that stops them getting across. And God says, so I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and he'll follow after them, and I'll get honor over Pharaoh and over all his armies, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. So they're now probably heading back up towards the Mediterranean because they've turned back. They've come south and they've come a little bit east. They're not going to go back west, but they have kind of turned back and going back towards the route which originally God wasn't leading them to. But there's perhaps a little bit more confidence because of the fire and the smoke and the fact that there's greater numbers as they've gathered together. But they get to a point which we kind of know for the Exodus crossing, the sea crossing. But actually the phenomena of the sea crossing, we actually have a modern description of it. So this is 1882. The canal in this text is not the ones we've been talking about, the old Egyptian one. It's the later Suez Canal, which on the map you can see onto as you're looking at it, your far right, you can see the Suez Canal runs up. But this is one of the top ends of this kind of series of Lake La Manzala. observed by Sir Alexander Tulloch, who's in charge of the British kind of input into the building of the Suez Canal. And he describes this. He says, an easterly gale came up very rapidly, driving the sand from the dry side and into my face. And the next morning I went to the canal bank, so the Suez Canal, again, and I noticed to my astonishment that the Lake Manzala on the west side of the canal had disappeared beyond the horizon in that direction, and the Arabs were walking on the mud where the day before boats had been floating. So he's describing a phenomenon that happens in this region, which is the way the Bible tells it, that is where the Israelites are being led, which is part of this connections of inland, reedy, freshwater lakes. And in one of these lakes, he describes it actually being pushed right the way back. If you actually summarize what he tells us has happened, he tells us that all night the east wind blew, and it pushes the lake water 7 miles to the east. Now that actually coincides very kind of well with what we read in Scripture. We have an imagination of the way that the Bible tells it, but actually if we stop and read carefully, we see this is actually a very good description that goes with the biblical narrative. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all night. So this phenomenon that has been observed, it's not common, but it has been observed to happen. There is a strong east wind that runs all night, and it made the sea into dry land. In the situation we've just read from a couple of hundred years ago, it's pushed the lake 7 miles to the east. In the context of where we're going to look at the children of Israel probably are, it only has to push it a few miles, and it would create a kind of a very clear channel that you could walk through. The children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and their left hand side. So in our imagination we think of we think of Charlton Heston as Moses leading the children through, and we see the great kind of walls on either side, but actually it could just simply be a reference to the waterworks, the canal works that are on either side of them, that are part of the walls of the ruler. But actually there is a kind of particular location which I think I've probably skipped past it too quickly. Let's see if I've got it on. Yeah, so if I go back a few slides and kind of talk to it on the map. Here we go. Towards right at the top, just before you get to the Mediterranean, there's this large body of water here, which is what the Egyptians refer to as the reeds. And you can just see at the very top of that end, before the lake even higher than that, it was not actually a lake, it's a lagoon, that other little blue splodge at the top. And you can see there's a kind of a line of blue, and that's the last part of that canal network. So that runs downhill from the Yam Suf, or from the Sea of Reeds, and it actually kind of runs into the desert and creates an artificial oasis. It was kind of something that goes back thousands of years, an artificial oasis there, by draining water downhill. So if an strong east wind comes and pushes that body of water eastwards, and because of the nature of the dip, it effectively creates a kind of a top end. The water disappears from the top end of the lake, but it wouldn't necessarily disappear from the canal, which would still be there. You see, so the wall of the ruler is still there. So there's a wall on one side and a wall on the other, but there is a kind of a path that would run through here, using the phenomena that was observed and which we've seen. And people sometimes they don't like it when you get too technical like this, but actually it describes an east wind. It actually is describing something that we know actually can happen. It's not common, maybe once in 100 years, but it's referred to in geographic terms or meteorological terms as water put down. I think that is, and the wind, kind of whirling wind, and the pressure changes and so on. It creates it in a kind of a flat lake, which can be kind of a good sort of 2 meters high, which is above the height of a person. You can actually totally drain the water out and kind of push it to one side, which is probably therefore what's happening, which is part of why I say you can treat the narrative as being people's observations of quite remarkable things that are really happening. So let me kind of come back to where we were, because we're nearly through these slides. Sorry, I've done them at rather some speed, but hopefully they help fill in the gap. So they've gone through, yes. So that's one possibility, is my own preferred one. I know that at the moment there's quite a lot of interest in the crossing of the Red Sea happening in the Gulf of Aqaba. If it happens in Gulf of Aqaba, we have to understand it slightly differently, but certainly sea levels are understood to be 15 meters or so lower, about 1500 BC, than they are today. So there is perhaps a strong wind at low tide. It could produce the same sort of effect over over kind of there's a sort of sand ridge between the two sides of the Gulf of Aqaba, and that's one of the other possibilities that people look at. I prefer the route I've just described because it fits the geography of the description of the children of Israel's journey better, in my view. Of course, it could just be 100% supernatural. It could have happened at the Red Sea. It could be any of those things. But anyway, this kind of remarkable miracle, which sets out the beginning. I haven't put it in the slides there, but as we know, they're pursued into the sea by Pharaoh's 600 chariots. But then, as the waters come back in, the chariots get bogged down, and actually, as they rise above the head level of the soldiers involved, who are way down with armor and everything else, they get drowned. So that's where we're going to pick up in the next session, which was captured successfully from a live recording. So anyway, hopefully this will work, at least in filling in the gap. Thanks, Em. So I will say goodbye, and we will go back and stop this recording.